Hospitals, libraries, nurseries and fire stations have blinked out of existence. £80 billion worth of spending cuts have cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. In the world's 7th richest economy, 1 in 5 children now live in poverty, even though most of their parents are in work.
6 years ago, Britain suffered a great recession. We had the biggest bank bailout in the world. We had the biggest deficit since the war. We suffered the deepest recession in modern times, or as the Shadow Chancellor put it, some mistakes were made. But later this year, the OBR expects Britain to reach the point when our economy is finally larger than before it collapsed 6 years ago.
People can't cope, and some of the stories that come through that are really heartbreaking, as in, for example, only recently we came across a mother who had a baby recently and her husband had left her, and her benefits were registered under his name, and it takes quite a while for benefits to transfer. So once we heard the story that she wraps her baby in towels rather than nappies because she doesn't have any money, and she was going dry because she doesn't have any money for food, and she was living in a bed and breakfast, and the reaction she gave once we had handed over her food parcel was just basically explained the whole thing. She just fell into tears and asked and thanked us, and you know, that kind of brings a tear to my eye, and like, it breaks hearts because we shouldn't be seeing people like this in this country.
Austerity, what does it mean? I googled it. The word is, this is the answer, the word I googled. Difficult economic conditions created by government measures to reduce public expenditure. That's what it states. Let me give you a statistic. 23 of the 29 members of the condemned government are millionaires. On top of this, they are proposing to give themselves a pay increase. An 11% pay increase in 2015. But no pay awards increases for the public sector. The bankers will not get me started on them. The hypocrisy of these people has no bounds.
With most planned spending cuts on pause until after the 2015 election, already policies that would have been unimaginable before the crisis have become reality. In this episode, we look at the birth of the crisis and how it's changed Britain, turning the gap between rich and poor into a chasm. Welcome to the Age of Austerity.
Well, the financial crash, you're talking really the period 2007 up to 2008, comes from really one thing, which is what happened over the decade prior to it, which is the development, the creation of debt on a very, very large scale, so that it became easier and easier for people, I mean really stretching very, very far into society, people to borrow, and to borrow on a very, very large scale. And what this did during the 2000s was keep the whole economy ticking over. That if you look in Britain, in America, in places that really went for this kind of model of capitalism, of how you run the economy, you're looking at places where incomes for most people were dropping or stagnant for that period of time, but people were expected to carry on buying. You're expected to borrow money to buy a house, you're expected to borrow money to buy a car, and so you go out and borrow, and banks were happy to lend. So you have this enormous debt bubble that's created. So you start off as a bank, you lend money to people who are likely to repay, and then you lend money to people who are less likely to repay, and then as you keep lending money, you eventually find people who really aren't going to repay. These are the subprime mortgages in America.
This principle of private ownership is undoubtedly the most fundamental element in the structure of American capitalism. Consider, for instance, home ownership, which is a bright American goal for most of our people. The desire to own one's own home, one's own property, provides a real incentive for almost all Americans to bring out their most productive efforts.
The global crisis began with the subprime mortgage crash of 2007. In an environment of intense competition and little regulation, modest interest rates on mortgages were used to tempt low-income buyers before rates were hiked up beyond what they could pay. By then, the mortgage lenders had usually repackaged the debt and sold it on to a third party, distancing themselves from the original risk so they could take even more. Many of these debts were purchased in the belief that they were safe, by pension schemes, for example, that lost everything in the crash. But the big banks that knew better made a killing. When a family defaulted on their loans, the bank simply took their house. And with property prices rising, there was big money in foreclosures.
If you're talking about subprime mortgages, you're talking about what they used to call ninja loans. So it's no income, no job, no asset loans. People with no job, no nothing, but they were told you can get a mortgage, you can get a house. Of course, if you don't have any money coming in, you can't repay your mortgage. And if you can't repay your mortgage, you default. You fail to repay the mortgage, at which point whoever loaned you the money is in trouble. And if this happens at a large scale, lots and lots of people who've been lending money are in trouble. That's basically what happens in the crash, that all these loans that have been created over that period of time started to fail. And that cascades throughout the entire system. It's an enormous global system you're talking about here and brings the whole thing down spectacularly in the case of Lehman Brothers, the third, fourth largest investment bank in the US, files for bankruptcy in September 2008. At that point, the entire system is on the verge of collapse because everyone realizes that it's built on sand.
That brings us to the second great pillar. Who can tell us what it is? All right, Mary.
The profit motive.
Yes, indeed. This is the stimulus that brings private ownership to life.
This is a copy of the bill which will provide for a $700 billion bailout of Wall Street. It has provisions in it where it talks about helping homeowners, but when you read the fine print, you see it has language like may instead of shall and encouraging instead of mandating help for the millions of homeowners who are worried right now about whether they're going to lose their home. There's no help for them in this. So what we have here is a rescue plan that essentially gives all the speculators a bailout and puts the bad debts in the custody of the government. That we're putting this up before an adjournment in an election season shows that Congress is being put under extraordinary pressure to bail out Wall Street. We haven't looked at any alternatives, Amy.
Conservative government have done, coalition government I should say, is that they have convinced voters and convinced the public of the argument that the deficit needs to come down and that public spending needs to be reined in, and as a result certain budgets need to be cut. And often the narrative around this is what's called difficult decisions. This is difficult choices.
It's an emergency, it's a crisis, we're going to end up like Greece, we have to cut spending right now. Complete lies. I mean, complete nonsense from one end to the other. Britain's public debt, but it's risen because we bailed out the banks and had a massive recession. It's not risen because we built too many hospitals or any of this kind of rubbish. And it's also not risen that, it's not that high.
And now to the third of the three great pillars in American capitalism. All right, Gary.
The open market.
Yes, the open competitive market, where anyone can offer his wares for sale at whatever price he can get, is a benefit not only to business and industry, but to the individual as well.
What we've seen actually is a big expansion in labour supply, particularly among the 50 to 64-year-old age group, where, I mean, obviously pension arrangements, women's pension age has gone up by 5 years, you no longer have to leave when you're 65. There's been a big expansion in labour supply, and actually a lot of the real wage, some of the real wage falls has been a compositional shift away from high wage to lower wage activities. But I would characterise I mean, if you look at productivity, which has been flat, real wages have been slightly lower, but I don't characterise it as being a kind of crisis of sort of Victorian proportions.
For the first time since World War II, the Red Cross is delivering food aid domestically. Britain has been blighted by a quiet epidemic of hunger, with over 1 million people now reliant on food banks. Austerity has pushed another 600,000 children into poverty.
So the cost of living crisis is a narrative that has come up because ultimately wages are low, and they're lower than the cost of living, they're lower than inflation. So most recently we've seen wages increase by about 0.5, 0.6%. The question mark is what is driving that effect? And as the Governor of the Bank of England said recently, it is the fact that the economy is trading off jobs growth for wages growth. So the argument being if wages were higher, there'd be less jobs and less people in work.
There's been an increase over the past year, and it's not the fact that's it's not the increase that's interesting, it's the fact that people ask for more specific things, like essential things people are in need of, and that's where they come to the food bank to basically. Something that is noticeable is that they come here just to feed their children, as in the benefit cuts have played a huge part in that, and we've seen a rise in guests coming in through our doors because of the cuts. And once they come in, we realise that there's a pattern, and the pattern is that people usually give off their money and pay it off to bills, and then they have no money left for food. So they come over here and we supply them with that. But it's not enough, and we can't do that. We can't do anything about it, is because maximum food vouchers is 4 per year.
This is Suffra Food Bank in Brent, North London. Here, those with nothing can collect food parcels provided by volunteers. Their guests range from homeless teens and refugees to pensioners and professors. Suffra also provides services to help guests get back on their feet, from cooking and financial classes to advice on education and employment.
Since came to food bank, I can see different people coming with little children, no food on the table. They are worried how they are going to pay the bills tomorrow. If they pay the bills, they don't have any money for food. And some of the children are 2 years, 1 year old, and they are really in tears when you see them.
This is Rosemary. She has a degree in law but has been struggling to find work. A mother of 2, she also does voluntary work with orphans and victims of domestic abuse. But for income, she relies on benefit payments.
This tax here, that tax there, government not wanting to help us, really. Just marginalizing us. I mean, if I have my way, I wouldn't want to be on sickness or anything to do with the benefits or anything. But if there's no food, there's no money, there's nothing. I didn't even know this place existed until I called Brent Council. The love shown by the staff, the acceptance, the non-discriminatory attitude towards me as a person, as an individual, it's overwhelming. I mean, the thousands and millions of families, children that are exactly in the same boat as me and my family are.
I can see a lot of, how can I explain, professional people are coming, and all different level of people are coming, which never came into my mind. First day I was very, very sad by looking at it, what the government has done. I thought that poor people only exist in third world country, like Africa, where I come from, Tanzania, or India, but never Britain.
With fuel poverty at all-time highs, many families are being forced to choose between eating and heating their homes. Trapped between benefit cuts and soaring energy prices, last winter over 31,000 Britons who couldn't afford to properly heat their houses were killed by the cold. an increase of 1/3 over pre-austerity years.
I pack the food and get it ready for each food parcel and then give it to the people. I think it's really important for those children to come here and see that we're helping them, because there was these 2 younger boys here and they were really happy that they were getting food and everything.
Reforming welfare is a vitally important aspect, regardless of whether we're in a time of austerity or not. The problem is that you have numerous people engaged with the welfare system in receipt of benefits, and each one has different stories to tell and different circumstances to tell. So it's about how to design a system that increases work incentives and make sure incentives are there to work.
The majority of individuals that I've seen coming to the food bank are not people who want to come here as a kind of as a way of life, but because they are in dire straits, they are in an emergency situation. So it's many people are very shy, they don't want to open up, and what really is driving that is because they may feel ashamed.
Thanks so much for your help in my hour of need. I won't forget and hope to be able to pay back in some way in the future. Kaylee.
This charity is wonderful. You are welcomed with open arms, with warm and caring human beings. In such a greedy society where making money and just profit seem to be the end, this place puts that to shame. Faith in the human spirit is refreshed when so many people are being crippled economically by government and state, to see help from such people.
Thank you for your help and kindness when I needed it. I don't know what I would have done without it. Ken.
I'm on job seekers allowance myself, so I've got bills to pay, and then I was offered that I could get some food, so obviously it was going to help me out money-wise as well. But what actually led me to it really is, I don't know, I just recently lost my mum, and she used to help me out, so if I was short 1 week, obviously she'd help me out until I got sort of back on my feet, sort of thing. So I sort of lost that, and then it's sort of come from that. I don't know too much about politics, but at the end of the day there is a big problem here, and I don't think they know enough. I mean, it's all good and well them sitting back down in Westminster or wherever they are trying to work out this or work out that, but at the end of the day, whatever they're doing is not working. So somebody needs to do something different. You know, maybe they need to get involved in the community a bit more. You know, instead of being in their offices or in Parliament shouting about this, shouting about that, or writing a letter here, writing a letter there. Maybe they need to get up and get out there and get involved.
Well, what neoliberalism does, and particularly its British variant, what we know as Thatcherism, I mean, firstly, what it did is turn what were once traditionally known as social problems and turn them into individual failings. So poverty and unemployment in the social democratic consensus, which dominated Britain in the aftermath of World War II, the underlying assumption of that was that unemployment and poverty were failings of a system that had to be addressed, therefore, by collective means, provision, the welfare state, for example. Because of Thatcherism, the unemployment queues dramatically increased. I mean, on the eve of Thatcherism, they mocked up a poster called "Labour Isn't Working," showing a long queue to the forerunner of the job centres, whatever they were called, a big dog queue.
I, as a person, I've lost hope in the government in this country, point blank. I've actually lost hope. Before I was very now I've actually totally lost hope. It's like everybody just says, you know what, we wake up in the morning, we sleep, we're trapped in the same routine. You know, we have all this intellectualism in our head, all these ideas, but we can't materialize it. So what can you do?
Most people on benefits are in work, only 3% are unemployed. Okay, so it's a non-issue. 3% is a tiny, tiny portion. What we should be asking ourselves is, why are so many people in work on benefits? And I think you're going to start asking the question, why aren't we paying people a living wage? You know, we have people all over the country working so hard to make ends meet, and yet they are still in poverty. They're still having to go to food banks. They're still having to choose between eating or feeding their children. It's really erode people's sense of dignity and expectations of a good quality of life. And I think it's designed to normalise mass suffering, poverty, inequality, mass inequality, because it isn't about money. The rich in this country have got so much richer during this financial crisis, and the poor have got poorer. So actually what we're seeing is the money is there, but the problem is it's concentrated in a very small amount of hands.
What did he steal? A loaf of bread, your worship. Scandalous. Why?
It wasn't for me, your worship. It was for my mother.
Why couldn't your mother steal for herself?
She was dying, your worship, of starvation, and I thought she might live if I...
Stuff and nonsense. Where is your mother now?
She didn't get no bread, your worship. She died.
The best thing she could do, too. I have no patience with people who are starving.
This period of austerity has been a huge burden for a health service which is not set up to deal with really social problems. Of course, when people are unemployed, underemployed, have no prospects, their welfare's cut, they can't manage, the first person they turn to often is their doctor. And so the so-called austerity, which we've had thrust on us, whether that's necessary or not, of course, another question, has had a big knock-on effect on the NHS.
The whole rhetoric of individual responsibility is more about, in the context in which it's used, is about blame. It's this idea that, again, if you're poor or unemployed, then that's your own fault. It's not because there's a lack of secure work. It's not because your wages are too low. Because we live in a country where most people in poverty are in work. Ian Duncan Smith, now he's the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, the custodian of our welfare state. And he constantly claims, you know, the way out of poverty is through work. His constituency has the second highest number of workers below the living wage in the whole country, which just puts that whole lie into perspective. And it is a lie.
Most children living in poverty now have working parents. While unemployment has been controlled, work is increasingly insecure. There are 6.4 million people in the UK unable to work enough hours with enough pay, the highest figure in 20 years. Underemployment has also been linked to a sharp spike in suicides since austerity measures begun. Meanwhile, inequality has reached record heights, with those living in wealthy areas living up to 13 years longer than those in poorer ones.
We have not gone for shock austerity in this country. We didn't do anything like Ireland. Departmental spending fell by 20 to 30% in Ireland. We didn't have anything like that. Some parts of government have been hit, but we're not talking about anything like what I would call austerity.
So what does real austerity look like? And what can it teach us about the future of the UK? In the next episode, we trace the hidden history of austerity in the Global South, and the very different policies on which the USA built its superpower status.